Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, collector, bookseller. And if you're new to the channel, just to sort of clarify things a bit, obviously anybody can start a booktube channel, but I'm slightly different than most people doing a SF booktube channel because I work in the book trade. I've worked in the book trade as a bookshop manager, bookseller, writer and editor for 40 years, and I'm the author of the book 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, which has been consistently in print since 2006. So what you tend to get here is informed opinion from the voice of SF Experience on YouTube. So welcome aboard if you're new. If you're not, hi there guys, welcome back. And this is a response to a request I posted on my channel asking people what was on their list of shame, the science fiction writers they felt that they should have read and they haven't. And do I have a list of shame? Not really. I don't really care about that sort of stuff, but we'll come on to that because this is going to be a two-parter. This first part is looking at the 12 authors whose names came up most consistently, and I'm going to tier rank them in 3 different segments, tier C, B and A. And then in the sequel video, which will come shortly after this one, I'm going to look at all the comments that were made and respond to them individually and personally, and tell people what I think about whether they should be worried about these writers that they haven't read or that they're going to read, or maybe I'll tell them not to read them and read something else instead. So we'll see. It was an interesting exercise because I didn't do a video to promote it because I thought if I do that I'll get so many. I'll be able to do a statistical analysis and that'll probably be it. But I wanted to do some responses as well. So I just did it as a community post on the channel. So the results were quite interesting. Was I surprised? It's hard to say really. Yes and no in some cases. But we're going to look first of all at tier C. What I did, rather than sort of break it down number of votes for each one, because of course you've got certain writers who got the same number of votes, so you can't sort of do like a top 10 or whatever, they're seriously ranked, so they do C. So the C writers are names which came up frequently, who people feel they should be having a go at, but they weren't as shameful as the ones higher up. What you're not going to get is some flashy table because, you know, we don't do that sort of thing here. We just get into the words because that's what books are about. So in no particular order in tier C, these are authors which came up. And what's interesting about tier C is these tend to be the writers I would consider, generally speaking, who are more literary, generally didn't have bestsellers, who have been sort of cult figures or important in an influential sense. Some of them have come up on list of shame here because they're authors I talk about on this channel and people feel they should have read them for that reason, but we'll dive straight into it. I want to begin with the female writers. So only 2 female writers came up in this sort of like top 12. And first of all, we'll get somebody who these days is really famous. She's dead now. There was a time when nobody read her books and nobody was interested, which is why her first editions are so valuable now. And that's Octavia Butler, and this is Kindred. Now, of course, because of the sort of cultural state we're in now, Octavia Butler being a black female SF author who's also sadly passed away, you know, she is like hot property, and most of her books are back in print apart from some of the early ones. And this is her most famous novel, Kindred. This is the UK first edition of Kindred. There was no hardcover, and it is very powerful. But I am not a massive fan of Butler. I think she writes well. There are moments where I think the prose is a little rougher than it could be, but at other times the astringency works really well. So people do feel they should read Butler. Personally, what do I think? She doesn't really resonate with me massively, but I would say she is good. This is a great read. I would recommend it. There is a video about it on the channel, but she doesn't hit me where I live. But it is interesting that people want to read her, because if you go back 10, 15, 20 years ago, as I say, nobody was interested. And this is a women's press edition from the mid-1980s. And what's interesting, and I've said this before on the channel, is the women's press SF, back at the time, I was selling them. They didn't sell brilliantly, and they were mostly bought by men. That's the reality of it, because women weren't reading SF so much then, which was a shame. As Brian W. Aldiss once said, we can't really take science fiction seriously until as many women as men read it. And is that happening now? I think more women are reading it, but science fiction actually is in a fairly decadent state now, and I'm not sure whether that's actually helping or not, but that's a topic for another time. So anyway, that was something which came up. The only other female author came up, which is somebody I approve of Moore, who I prefer as a writer. And when I give a judgment, it's mostly on two things. It will be on what I feel their literary merit is, because that's always been a big thing for me, how well written is an SF novel, and also its significance in the history of SF. And the other person people came up with for feeling shamed about not reading was Joanna Russ. And this is The Female Man. This is probably her most important novel, her most famous one. It's a Gollancz masterwork these days. This again is a women's press edition in A format from the mid-80s. You'll see the difference there. The Butler is a B format, a bigger book. So this is in the classic pocket side. Unfortunately, it's got a bit of a ding there. And this is a great book. It's very sort of powerful and angry. And of course, she wrote a book called How to Suppress Women's Writing, which ironically is out of print. And I really think you should read this. It's not an easy book, but whenever I'm working as a bookseller and people talk to me about Margaret Atwood, I say to them, Margaret Atwood didn't start this feminist dystopia thing. There was a massive wave of it in the 1970s. And Joanna Russ, Susie McKee-Charnas, Marge Piercy, all these people were involved and did their own takes on things. And I think this is a really important one. So I do think you possibly should read this, because it's very important, not just in terms of the quality of the writing, but it is an absolute landmark in the history of women coming to SF as writers. Of course, there have always been female SF writers, going right the way back to the moment when the genre was named. The first really important female SF writer, in terms of it being genre SF from 1926 onward, is C.L. Moore, of course, who's absolutely brilliant. So I do think you should read this. Interestingly, C.L. Moore didn't come up on this list, which is interesting, but I think people are reading her more, which is really good. And I've been a sort of proselytizer on my channel for her work. So, to continue with Tier C, all these people had roughly the same number of votes. We get into one of my favourites, and that's Thomas M. Dish. And I've been delighted over the last few years to see Thomas Dish becoming somebody who is being read more and more and more, which is really good news. Tom Dish is dead. He committed suicide. Very sad story. This is his collection, Getting Into Death, which is typical of Tom's titles. And this is a Hart Davis one from, I think it's the early 70s. And this says a collection. It's typographical cover. Very beautiful, as you see. UK first edition. And Tom Dish is the sort of mordant master of black wit in SF. And the thing with Dish is, because he was gay, because he used to write provocative essays about the fact that maybe SF was a branch of children's literature, a lot of the old Golden Age guys and hard SF writers really didn't like him. And there was a couple of years on and off with a Nebula Award where there was no award in various categories. And that was because a lot of those guys who were more on the sort of right realised that everybody, the sort of younger Turks, would vote for Tom Dish and he was going to win the things. And, you know, there's strong evidence to suggest that they voted for no award to ensure that Dish didn't get in. It probably happened to some other writers as well, which is a great, great shame. So there you go. But Tom Dish is being read more widely now. I would say the best place to start with Tom's work, if you're a traditional SF reader, because he was a new wave writer and a very literary writer, I read him for the sheer joy of his prose, and he's so funny and sophisticated, he could write anything. I would say you want to go with a book like The Genocides, his first novel, which has a wonderful ending, and other early books like The Puppies of Terror, aka Mankind Under the Leash, and the very wonderful Camp Concentration. They are key books of late 60s, early 70s SF, and he had a distinguished career, but sadly not a massive amount of commercial success, but he managed to make a living until fairly late. Great, great stuff, Tom Dish. So I'm delighted to see that people are feeling they should read Tom Dish, because he was a really important figure, and it would be nice to see his work coming back into prominence. Somebody else who, I don't know if anybody else on BookTube talks about this writer besides me. I know Richard at Vintage SF does, because I think he sort of discovered him through me. And I'm a massive fan of this writer. Another writer who's dead, sadly, and that's Keith Roberts. This is Kite World. This is the Arbor House US first edition. I do have a UK first as well. And I should say that Keith Roberts hated the cover of this book. And Kite World, if you've heard of Keith Roberts, you've probably heard of his novel Pavan, which is generally regarded as the finest alternative history novel in the SF canon, with the possible exception of The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. As much as I love The Man in the High Castle, I actually prefer Pavan. I think it's a more classically oriented novel. The structure's more conventional in some ways, but it is a fix-up. This is the book which is most like Pavan. So if you have read Pavan, this is very much one you can go for if you've already discovered Keith. And how can we describe him? He was a British writer. He came up during the New Wave period. He wasn't a New Wave writer, though he was associated with it. He didn't think a lot of the experimentation in the New Wave, but he was a traditional novelist in the old school sense. And I always refer to him as the Thomas Hardy of science fiction. He wrote a lot about the British landscape. His novels tend to be all set in Britain. They're often post-nuclear things. He was very concerned about communism. He was very, very good at writing short stories, which he would then fix up into mosaic novels. Most of his novels were constructed that way, including this one. I remember vividly reading the first part of this, was published as a short story in, I think it was the very first issue of Interzone magazine in the mid-80s, or it was certainly an early one, maybe not the first one. But he's a brilliant prose stylist and absolutely fantastic. If you like John Wyndham, he's sort of in between John Wyndham and J.G. Ballard, a very serious writer, really, really fine writing, and the world building is absolutely superb. And Kite World is set in a post-nuclear England where some parts of it are like Badlands, nobody can go in them, but there's parts which have survived. And there is a military ecclesiastical sort of organisation in this, and they send up these kites to watch over the Badlands where there are demons, and fantastic. Another thing Keith is really good at is very sympathetic portrayals of female protagonists, particularly young ones, and he was really good at foregrounding them. And again, he was like Tom Dish. He had a very, very sad end, and not quite as sad as Tom's, but he was somebody who was quite a lonely man and a troubled figure, but a great writer, so you really should read him. It's very important if you want to sort of raise the bar in terms of the quality of writing you're reading within SF, to read writers like Keith Roberts and Tom Dish. Somebody I've mentioned a bit on the channel, and I feel guilty now that I haven't mentioned him more. I've mentioned him quite a few times, and I want to go back to reading him. I reread one of his short stories a few months ago, and I'd forgotten how brilliant it was, is Lucius Shepard. Lucius Shepard, this is the Jaguar Hunter. This is the world first edition in Arkham House. And I bought this at the Worldcon in 1987, I seem to remember, and that's a J.K. Potter cover. This is short stories. This was his second book after the novel Green Eyes, I seem to remember. And here's the UK first of Green Eyes in Chateau and Windus, which is a zombie novel with a difference. But we won't talk about that now, you'll find out about another time. But Shepard was a comparatively late starter as an SF writer. I don't think he was published till he was about 34, maybe a bit older, and he died relatively young. I know there's a theme emerging here, and he did all sorts of things. You know, he was like in a rock band, and he sort of sold t-shirts, and there was one rumour at one point that he was involved with sort of drug smuggling or on the fringes or something like that. And he set an awful lot of stories in exotic locales around the world. His early work is marked by stories set in jungles, so they have a very heavy, powerful, sweaty, tropical redolence. They're often set in Latin America or Asia, and his first 4 books are all marked by that, and the writing is just absolutely superb. He's kind of between J.G. Ballard and William Gibson, is how I would say. I wouldn't say he's a cyberpunk writer. He has certain affinities with magical realism, but very, very rich prose. And he would stray into sort of fantasy and horror as well as SF. And he is just amazing. I stopped reading him after the first 4 books for a few years because I felt he'd sort of nailed the jungle motif into the ground a bit too much. But these are superb stories. Probably his keynote book for beginners would be the novel Life During Wartime, which is a Gollancz masterwork, his second novel, which is really great, which is a near future thing. And it's kind of like, if you imagine if David Cronenberg had filmed Apocalypse Now and crossed it with Videodrome and elements of Philip K. Dick's Ubix, you get the idea, because there are, it's set in this sort of Latin American state where there's American intervention. There was a lot of that going on in the 80s, where the US was involved in knocking over Marxist republics in Latin America. It was a very political sort of Reaganite type thing. And Shepard was responding to that in a way. And in Life During Wartime, there's a core of, they're like a psi core, they're people with psi powers, and they're all off their faces on drugs, and it's very, very psychedelic, and they're great stuff. And naturally one thinks of Conrad because the old Heart of Darkness thing, but Shepard, yeah, so I've talked about it a bit, so I'm glad to see that people are keen to read Shepard, because he really is a very rewarding experience, particularly in the short forms are excellent. We then come across a writer who was really, really famous, a lot more famous in Britain and Europe than in the States. He's generally mostly in print in the States, and he always used to get published in the States. In fact, his first novel was commissioned by a US paperback publisher, and that was The Wind from Nowhere. And we're talking about J.G. Ballard, and this is The Terminal Beach. Terminal Beach is probably his key collection, his key mid-60s collection of short stories. And this is a mid-80s reprint. I don't have a first, boy, but I like one. And Ballard had a very long and distinguished career, which lasted from the late 50s when he started writing SF stories, and then he died in about 2009 of prostate cancer, and he won all sorts of accolades, and he's been one of the most influential novelists over British writers per se in the last sort of 50 years or more. And the Guardian said, you know, he was the best British novelist of the latter half of the 20th century, and I completely agree with that. And his influence has been as much over mainstream writers as it has over SF writers. His key influence over SF writers was in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, because he was probably the cardinal example of English New Wave writing, who took the influence of people like William Burroughs and meshed it with the social science SF that you used to get in magazines like Galaxy and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction in the 50s. So he was a big fan of people like Sheckley and Pohl and Philip K. Dick, those sort of writers. And The Terminal Beach is a great one. Be aware that the US edition has different content, and it's a different sort of beast altogether. This is the one to go for, the British edition. You don't have to have this particular edition as long as it's the British one, because the contents are different. And The Terminal Beach itself is probably the entry story for anybody interested in genuine New Wave. And of course there's a difference between British New Wave and US New Wave. There were some US writers who came over to the UK to work with New Worlds magazine. Michael Moorcock edited that. Ballard was heavily involved. And the US New Wave is more clustered, it's vaguer, and it's more clustered around the idea of Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions anthology, which is more about taboo breaking and what you could and couldn't do in SF publishing. And there's an awful lot of stuff in Dangerous Visions which isn't New Wave at all in terms of its modernist experimental sort of thing. It's more about taboo breaking, whereas British New Wave was more about technique and a new way of telling SF stories. So Ballard's really important. He is very, very far indeed from traditional Golden Age SF. He is nothing like people like Frank Herbert, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein. He is a lot more modernist. He has more in common with existentialist writers than with pop writers, but he's really important, incredibly powerful, and he was a heck of a nice guy as well. And I'm a massive Ballard fan, and it's weird. I mean, you can't really put SF into context about where it was going in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s until you've read Ballard. And you should really read Ballard before you read something like William Gibson, because even though they're different, the one kind of leads into the other. In the evolution of science fiction, there is a kind of genealogy which leads from people like, say, H.G. Wells, then the Golden Age, and especially when you get the 50s, where you get the more literary American writers, and you get John Wyndham in the UK, that feeds into people like Ballard, which feeds later on into cyberpunk writing, and so on. And then it all comes crashing down in the 90s with the new space opera renaissance. But this is really important stuff. You should read Ballard. After a certain point, virtually none of his work is pure SF, because it's set 5 minutes in the future, and it really is about the effect of technology on the human mind. And to quote the famous things, Ballard long ago in the 60s said, "Earth is the only alien planet," and that's really what we should focus on in SF. So there you go. So there we go. Finally, in Tier C, we have another one of my favourite writers, who I've loved for many years, and you know, he is getting mentioned more on BookTube. Again, I think I've mentioned quite a lot about him. I know that Matt at Bookpilled is a big fan, because Matt and I had a discussion about it, because Matt used to email me earlier in his channel and say, you know, what do you think of this, what have you, and Matt and I have similar tastes a lot of the time, so it's quite sort of healthy that way. And that's Barry N. Malzberg. This is Heroics World, and this is a US first edition from Random House, and Barry N. Malzberg came up as a writer in the 1960s. He's still alive. He's quite old now. He still produces things now and again. And he saw himself as having a career as a literary writer. He couldn't sell his literary stuff. He studied writing drama when he was in college. And he worked for the Scott Meredith Literary Agency a lot, late 60s, early 70s and onwards, I think, as well. And he burst upon the scene in the late 60s with some short stories written under the name K.M. O'Donnell. And K.M. was for Kuttner and Moore. He was a big fan of Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore, and we'll come on to them in the second part of this video. And Malzberg, he's very grim and depressing. He almost always writes in first person. His characters are always having sex, but it's very grim and very joyless. They have strange neurotic obsessions, and his work is, not for the faint of heart, but it is serious. If you like Philip K. Dick, I would say he falls between somebody like Philip K. Dick and Robert Silverberg. In a way, he doesn't fall between them. If you imagine them as a double star system, he would be the planet stuck between them, who's having the three-body problem, as it were. And he's also very funny, but in a very dark, black way. So if you like Tom Dish, you love Barry N. Malzberg. This is one of my favorites. Herowit's World is about a writer called Jonathan Herowit, who is trapped in an endless cycle of writing pulp SF novels, and it's gradually driving him nuts. He's gradually going insane, and his wife's not very happy with him. And it begins at a convention, and a fan who isn't very pleased with his latest writing throws a drink in his face. And it does go into a science fiction thing, where there is a science fiction narrative that ties to what's happening in Jonathan Herowit's life, and whether it's all in his head or not is another matter. So this is a classic example of recursive SF, where Malzberg was commenting on what it was like to be a science fiction writer in the late 60s and 70s. And he rather shocked the establishment again with the publication of a book called Beyond Apollo, which won the John W. Campbell Memorial Award. It was the first John W. Campbell Memorial Award after Campbell died, and Campbell, of course, was the mastermind of the Golden Age. He edited Astounding in its most important period throughout the Golden Age from 39 to 46, and beyond that the magazine was retitled Analog, and he sort of created the idea in the mass media of what science fiction actually was. And even though Malzberg liked Campbell, his work is more about deconstructing science fiction and showing maybe where it should be going, and he became very despondent about the way that the field, the fans, the publishers let everything down. So Malzberg, he really is an important writer per se. If Barry Malzberg had managed to get mainstream novels published, he did, but they were sort of for low rent, pulpy publishers. They were sort of mildly sexy and spicy, and he wrote sort of crime novels as well. But if he'd managed to get pure literary novels published, they would have been regarded as very important indeed. Sadly, that never happened, which is a great shame. Shame on publishers. Malzberg, very important. It's getting harder to find his books now since I've been talking about him more, but I do think he's seminal. A good place to start is a book like Guernica Night. Beyond Apollo is a good one as well. He hasn't written a full-length SF novel since about 1983, just short stories and bits and pieces. Great stuff. So that's tier C. So we get some good solid literary writers in there and a couple of female writers. Moving on to tier B, these are all writers who've got pretty much the same level of attention in terms of I feel I should read these. And they are a mixed bag. They're an interesting bag, actually. And I'm going to begin with somebody who, is world famous and is one of the names who's associated in the public mind with SF, and that's Arthur C. Clarke. This is a Gollancz omnibus of 4 great SF novels with a beautiful Chris Frost cover. Isn't that nice? City and the Stars, The Deep Range, Fall of Moondust, and Rendezvous with Rama. And Clarke, of course, most famous for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which he wrote with Stanley Kubrick. If you've got early editions of the book, you see Kubrick is fully credited. It was written at the same time the film was made. It was based on Clarke's earlier story, The Sentinel. And Arthur C. Clarke is a figure who goes back in British science fiction writing to the 1930s, and he's a very, very important figure that way. And he obviously has been gone for a long time. It's interesting how people haven't read Clarke. There is still Clarke in print. I actually collect old Clarke paperbacks, but I actually find him unreadable now. As a kid and a teenager, I read 2001 again and again and again. I read things like Fall of Moondust, Deep Range, those sort of things. But now I actually find him unreadable. His prose, I think, is very, very awkward and clunky. His characterization is virtually non-existent. But what people read Clarke for is his ideas. And he's the patron saint of people like, say, Stephen Baxter, Peter F. Hamilton, because he has these great ideas. And he conceived the communication satellite as an idea, of course. So we do owe him quite a lot. But if you compare him to, say, John Wyndham, who's kind of a contemporary, he never had Wyndham's mastery of prose style. So do I think you should read R.C. Clarke? I think you probably should. But I would say, I mean, the ones people go bonkers for are 2001, naturally, which is really great, and Rendezvous with Rama, the ultimate big dumb object novel. And I think the other day, Matt at Science Fiction Read said he didn't like that phrase, big dumb object, which is something which comes from the Science Fiction Encyclopedia. And he was talking about Bob Shaw's Ragged Astronauts trilogy. And fundamentally, he didn't like the idea it was dumb. But of course, it doesn't mean dumb as in stupid. It means dumb as in silent. Because when you get things like Rama and Ringworld, all these things, they don't speak. Orbitsville and Bob Shaw, they don't tell you. You don't know what these mysterious objects are. And that's part of the sense of wonder in which Clarke specialised. So you probably should read some, but don't expect great prose. But you will get sort of important ideas. So that's the sort of summing up. Lovely book, this. Looking at the contents, Fall of Moondust is in here, and I think that's really minor. Rendezvous with Rama I find really tedious, I have to be honest. The Deep Range I've tried to read several times, never got through, not as a teenager, not as an adult. And City of the Stars is probably the best one in here. But there you go, Arthur C. Clarke. So it's quite surprising to see people hadn't read him. I think most people with Clarke will read 2001 and probably stop there. And I don't think that's entirely a bad thing myself. You may disagree. Please add what you think below in the comments. Then somebody who is also British came along a little later than Clarke. He started to, his work started to appear in the sort of early 50s. By the late 50s, he was really going for it, and was probably one of the most important British science fiction writers ever, and I'd argue one of the most important science fiction writers per se, and that's Brian W. Aldiss. This is Frankenstein Unbound in the Jonathan Cape UK first edition. Very beautiful, as you see. This is from the 70s, early 70s, and Aldiss was a soldier, a bookseller, and a writer, and he was a really nice guy. I met him a couple of times, and Aldiss again was quite literary as well. But at the same time, he really loved pulp SF. He loved all the tropes, all the sort of ideas, all the imagery. And he worked with pretty much all of them throughout his career. But what he's really great at is matching that with the quality of prose. So you often get SF ideas which other people have done, but you also get stunningly original things like Hothouse, for example, known in America as the, what was it called in the States? The Long Afternoon of Earth, I think it was originally called over there. And you get Greybeard, which is brilliant. This is a favourite as well. And the thing with all this, he just tried it on. He's very chewy prose at times. There's a video on my channel called The Most Disgusting and Repulsive Aliens in SF, in which I look at a couple of his early books. And I do love his work. I should do more about it, really. And people feel they should read Aldiss. He wrote the first really important history of science fiction, which is called Billion Year Spree, later revised as Trillion Year Spree. It might be the other way around. I can never remember, even though I've read it loads of times. And he sort of put things into context, really. And Aldiss is important because he also had mainstream bestsellers in the UK in the 70s. So he was almost like the SF version of somebody like Anthony Burgess. So he had really good judgment, and he wrote reviews for Oxford Mail a lot and things, and he was pretty much the man. And he sort of set the basic literary standard for science fiction in the UK. So in a way, he was a kind of solidifying figure, a sun around which everybody else could revolve. And sometimes the planets outshone the sun, but he's still really important. So you should read all this. Massive oeuvre, at least 100 books. I would say the finest ones. I mean, Non-Stop is a textbook example of how you construct a science fiction novel with a double conceptual breakthrough ending. Recently, Ira at SF Words of Wonder talked about, he did a little thing about some short stories which Barry Marsberg picked up on, and he said how many of them had twist or double twist endings. They're not twist endings, they're conceptual breakthroughs, which is slightly different. And a conceptual breakthrough towards the end of a science fiction story or novel is pretty much essential. And if you're writing classical science fiction, you really have to go for it. And Aldous really understood that really well. So Non-Stop is a fantastic one to start with. It's a Generation Starship novel. Hothouse, extremely imaginative. It's not really very science fictional, but it's incredibly imaginative. It's more like a fantasy novel in many ways, though there's no magic in it. It's just very, very unlikely. And Greybeard is really his sort of English pastoral thing, which is comparative to things like Mary Shelley's work and Richard Jefferies' work. So all this really important stuff. Great writer, and he was a fantastic guy. Met him a couple of times. Real character, wonderful voice. You never forget what his voice sounded like. So if you can find YouTube videos of him, do watch them, because he's a great guy. Then somebody who is becoming more famous after many decades really in obscurity, which is strange because he was huge in the 60s and 70s. He won loads and loads and loads of awards. He was a very difficult man, as is well known, and he fell off the radar a lot in the 80s because, one, he fell out with every mainstream publisher he ever worked with, and two, because he wrote short stories. And in the wake of Star Wars, short stories started to disappear from SF. And these days, if I look at what's published in new science fiction, in genre science fiction, you know, if you're a writer and you want to get a short story collection published, I mean, you're going to struggle, really. You're going to have to establish yourself as some best-selling novelists with best-selling novels. And then your publisher may let you, you know, publish a collection just to keep you quiet. Either that, or you have to go to a small press like PS or New Con or one of the American presses. So, you know, it really is something. But this writer wrote almost nothing but short stories. That's Harlan Ellison. This is Blood's a Rover, which is the collected Vic and Blood stories and unfilmed screenplays. The most famous story in this is a story called A Boy and His Dog, which, for my money, is the finest post-apocalyptic narrative ever written. It's even better than The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And the whole idea was he would write several of these things, and they're set in the future after nuclear war. And there are still people living above ground in America, and they either form gangs, they're called rover packs, or they go solo, and they're called solos. And the solos usually have a dog with them, and the dog is usually telepathic. Sounds absurd, but it's absolutely brilliant, incredibly savage. And Ellison seemed to survive through, there's a story called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. And for some reason, audio versions of that story kept sort of popping up. And it's not one of my favourite Ellison stories. It's very powerful when you first read it. I reread it a while ago for the first time in years, and I actually think it's quite crude compared to his other stories. But it's about an AI that takes over the world and kills everybody apart from a small group of people who are living underground in a maze of subterranean caverns, and it basically tortures them for its own amusement, this AI. And really, it's a very savage story. And that seemed to sort of hang on. And occasionally in work, people come in and say, oh, have you got I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream? And even though there was a short story collection of that title, it's not a full-length novel. It was recently reissued in the Harlan Ellison's Greatest Hits, which has done really well. It's been great to be able to sell that. But for many years, Ellison's work was only coming out print on demand and in small press collectible editions because he was just so awkward. It was that simple. He didn't want to compromise with these things, and that's fair enough. He'd already had loads of plaudits and loads of success. And his work is just amazing. I mean, the key period is science fiction stories from the very end of the 50s until the mid to late 70s are amongst the finest SF stories I've ever read. I put them up there with the short fiction of Alfred Bester, which I revere to a huge degree. So you should read Ellison. It is that simple. There's no excuse not to. These days, because of his estate passing over and being looked after by J. Michael Straczynski, who's issued new editions of Dangerous Visions and again Dangerous Visions. You read those, there's not much Ellison fiction in them. There's loads of his introductions and essays, which are brilliant. He was a brilliant polemical non-fiction writer. I love reading. When I've read Dangerous Visions and again Dangerous Visions, I enjoy his forwards and afterwards almost more than most of his stories. That's the thing. You know, he was absolutely on fire. Great stuff. The best collections, in my view, are The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart part of the world, particularly if you can get the UK one. The American one has slightly different contents. And Deathbird Stories, which is from the mid-70s, which is fantastic. So Ellison is the one. Somebody who almost broke through into Tier A was the final writer in Tier B. And I thought he was going to come up on top in this. The one who comes up on top, I was surprised by, and you'll be surprised by as well. But sort of licking at the very top of the ice cream on Tier B is Gene Wolfe. And this is The Shadow of the Torturer, the first book of the New Sun. This is the UK first edition in Sidgwick and Jackson with the Bruce Pennington jacket. There you go. Absolutely lovely. None of this Folio Society nonsense. And Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe, back in the 80s when I started bookselling, these were really popular. They sold really well, but they were still quite culty. You didn't sell as many of them as you did of things, because they were marketed as fantasy novels pretty much. They are SF. But things like David Eddings, Raymond Feast, Terry Pratchett, Michael Moorcock even, Anne McCaffrey were all doing really, really well. And these used to do pretty well as well. I used to always have them stacked high. But they are a very different character. They have more in common with somebody like M. John Harrison. And Wolfe, I have to admit, I blow hot and cold about Wolfe. He's somebody who I admire intellectually, but very rarely hits me on a gut or emotional level. And, people go absolutely bonkers for his work. I think there is a kind of mystique about Wolfe, because he was one of those writers who would hide things in unplain sight. What he's really writing about isn't represented in the front of the narrative. You've got to dig for it, and that was very much one of those things. And there are times when I think that works really well, and other times when I think it's just self-indulgent. He's not the only writer who does that. M. John Harrison does that, but he does it, I think, in a more human way and a wittier way, and in a way which I think is actually more literary. But Wolfe has a kind of mystique around him, which reminds you of things like Homer. They have this sort of heavy, and yet at the same time light. There's a kind of lightness in them. I sort of really enjoy the sort of more frothy and colourful parts of the prose. But sometimes he does overwrite. I think I was rereading The Beginning of the Earth and the New Sun, the fifth one, and there's the sequence with the character jumping the different layers on the starship, and you just like, does this really need to go on this long? But Wolfe, he is mad, but he doesn't resonate with me personally in that way. I do have quite a bit of Gene Wolfe. I have quite a few I haven't read, so I am planning to do more on the channel. I've only really done one video about him, which I analysed a short story, because I like his short stories a lot, and maybe I'll do more. But people feel bad about not reading this. Should you really be worried about it? Well, I think you should at least read Shadow of the Torturer. I mean, it is something interesting, and you also see how it reflects writers like Jack Vance as well. So, and he's important in terms of laying the groundwork for what became known as the New Weird, except there's no such thing as the New Weird, really. You just need to go back to Mervyn Peake. But yeah, so there we go. So we come to the top tier, the writer who above all others, you, viewers of this channel, feel they should have read and haven't. And I was quite surprised by this. In other ways I wasn't, because he's somebody I struggle with for years, and he's completely canonical. And a few years ago I was in work on a Saturday, and I was sort of mooching around the SF section, as I often do, and there was a young guy, probably between about the ages of 18 and 22, and he was talking to a friend, and they're trying to sound really knowledgeable, and he said, Isaac Asimov is the go-to science fiction writer you should go for. And I was thinking, oh yeah. And this is The Caves of Steel, UK 80s hardcover reissue, Chris Foss cover, very beautiful. This is my favourite Asimov book, actually, interestingly enough, and it amazed me. But at the same time, the thing with Asimov is you've got to remember, it's the famous books, the Foundation books, the early ones, were written a very long time ago. They were an episodic magazine serial, the initial Foundation trilogy, from sort of about 39 right the way through the 40s. And of course, there's the ones in the 80s. And the early robot stories, the ones which are in iRobot, were written late 30s, sort of early 40s. And it has to be said, they are as clunky as hell. They're not fun reads, in my opinion. They're very dry. They are very ideas based. Don't get me wrong, he had fantastic ideas, great ideas, but he wasn't much of a writer. He wasn't much a characterization. The prose is very flat and unpoetic. He doesn't describe things physically at all. You don't get a visual sense of what they're like. But then in the mid-50s, when he wrote this, he flowered, and this is a fantastic book, and I love this and its immediate sequel, The Naked Sun. I like all the robot novels. I think they're much better than the short stories. I think they've got real charm to them. And also I do like Prelude to Foundation, which has Harry Seldon in it, who's in the early part of Foundation, and who comes up with the idea of the Encyclopedia Galactica and Foundation. So people feel bad they haven't read Asimov. What I would say is that you don't need to read a lot, in my opinion. If he really grabs you and you love him, then go for it, but you can have a good understanding of how he influenced science fiction and how it developed if you read just the initial robot novels and probably the first 2 or 3 Foundation novels. And I used to really struggle with him in my teens. I used to think he was fairly dull as a prose stylist, but that's because I was reading people like Ellison, Philip K. Dick, Ray Bradbury, John Wyndham, people who had far more literary flourish than somebody like Asimov. So those were the top 12 list of shame titles for viewers of this channel. In the next video, I'm going to go through your comments and respond to them and talk to you about what I think, whether I think you should worry about what you've read, what you haven't read, and so on. Thanks for watching. If you're new here, do like, subscribe, comment. There's also a club room, so if you want to join as a member, it's £4.99 a month. That's £4.99, and you get an extra exclusive video every week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.